Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Q&A Cafe, Tenant Refreshes and SAP Business by Design with your host, Alex Waddell. My name is Catherine, and I will be facilitating today as per usual. And then don't forget to join us next week. That is Wednesday, May the 19th already, for our next Q&A Cafe on financial key figures and SAP Business by Design. Everyone will remain on mute since this session will be recorded and sent out within a couple of days. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Alex.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Welcome, everyone. So thank you for joining. So my name is Alex Waddell, and my role here at VistaView is to help clients and staff members become enabled in how to use SAP ByDesign. And I have 14 years of experience at VistaView, as my gray hair will attest, and over 2.5 years of experience with SAP Business by Design. So why do you want to test tenant refresh? Well, first of all, I mean, how many of you even knew you had a test tenant? So if you're a user of the system, you might not be aware of that. If you're a system administrator, you surely are. So the main reason you want to keep your test tenant refreshed, and by refreshed, I mean a current snapshot of your production environment as of a certain point in time, is really to keep your contemporaneous data current. So much of what you input in the system has some sort of relationship to date validation. So for example, if you're trying to do some sort of a test in your system and the periods aren't really lining up with the actual today's date that you're doing the transaction, you could run into errors that are actually, not relevant to your production environment, but causing you problems with your testing. And along the same line, so any particular issue you may be trying to resolve, like some sort of a block transition or transaction, it might not exist in the test environment as this is a new issue. So if this is something that you've been asked to sort of figure out, hey, we've got a posting issue, something that's not working, in order for you to reproduce the issue, the simplest way to do it may be to just refresh the test environment. And then by virtue of that, your issue is copied into the test environment. And that will, save you the steps of trying to figure out how they created that problem in production. And then other usage scenarios become frustrating when your data is just out of date. So, if you're trying to train employees and, periods aren't open, or the data that you're asking them to look up doesn't really match your production environment. So those are the main reasons why you want to keep your test tenant refreshed. And just keep in mind, a test tenant refresh is really an exact copy of your production environment at a specific moment and brought in. So the moment that refresh is installed, your environment is already out of date. So there will have already been new transactions in your production system. So you'll want to think about, the frequency of when you'll want to do a refresh. You could just sort of set that up as something that you put in your own calendar and you do it on a frequent basis. Or you may need to do some planning, as I'm about to talk about now, or you may just do it on demand when users need it. So everything we're going to show you today is inside this one work center. Because of the nature of the Service Control Center exposing, URLs and things like that, I've decided to do this presentation just in PowerPoint. So I've given you all the information you need, but this allowed me to sort of blur out some sensitive information. And then afterwards, I can go into a test tenant and show you a couple things depending on what sort of questions people might have for me. So for today, a part in the PowerPoint, but where you'll be doing your work is inside this particular work center. If you don't have access to this work center, that doesn't surprise me. You would need to be a system administrator. Everything inside this work center is fairly sensitive, and you need to know how to do it properly. Not that it's difficult, but you definitely don't want to make a mistake. You don't want somebody that's not qualified to overwrite a test environment. So we'll be working in the Service Control Center. So before we get started, you are going to just want to think about what's involved in this refresh, because there's a few things that could impact you. So one of them, SAP themselves is also doing work on your tenants. Every quarter, they will be doing an upgrade to your test tenant. They will do that a number of weeks before they upgrade your production environment. And as a system administrator, it's incumbent upon you to understand that calendar, because you should also be testing your test or all your production processes in your test system on that new upgrade to make sure that everything works. That's probably an entire subject for another cafe that we could talk about. But just, keep that in mind in principle. And while those events are happening, SAP has planned outages of sorry, not outages, but they've reserved your system for their activities, and they will not honor your requests. They in fact, you'll get an error if you try and upload a request during that time frame, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then, so that's an external impact. And then an internal impact, you're going to need to think about, will a refresh interfere with other testers? So be aware of who else is using the test environment. If you are a system administrator, you might not be aware that some of the users are doing training or they're doing their own testing. They may be testing features in the system. They may not necessarily be enabling new functionality, but they could be testing something that has nothing to do with the configuration. Maybe it's just, maybe they've set up a new bill of materials in a different way, and they wanted to do that in a test environment. And that test they could be doing may span a certain amount of time. And so it could be upsetting to them to sort of log in and discover that the work they had done to build out that information has just been overwritten by this fresh copy of production where their test data no longer exists. So keep that in mind, and the same thing for developers. So you could have people developing custom code in the system, and depending on the nature of that software development, they could lose a significant amount of work there as well. So do keep that in mind. Refresh requires a production outage. So everything I've talked about previously was really relating to your test environment, but in order to create a test environment, we have to take, or SAP will be taking down your production environment for a very short period of time, likely an hour. And that means you have to plan these refreshes around when it is a good time for you to take down production for that short amount of time so that you minimize disruption. So inside that work center, you see that at the top right. There's a few different screens or views that you can go into. The one that is very useful as part of your planning is the maintenance schedule. And you can see that either as a calendar or as a list of events. The screenshot that I'm showing you here is an example of the calendar. And so you can see in here that while this says Wednesday, May 12th today, we are actually in a cycle right now of test and production upgrades from SAP. And I can tell that because of those boxes over to the right, where it's saying on Saturday and Sunday, there's certain events that are happening. And those events probably are specific off hours that they're telling you your production environment is going to be down either for maintenance or potentially for a functional upgrade. So you can pay attention to the color coding on the box to know the nature of those kind of upgrades. And you can see that there's one on May 22nd in yellow, where there's going to be an upgrade happening. And that upgrade impacts the time band that we're in as well. I'm going to show you another place where you can see that information. So once you've done your planning and you're ready to go in and do it, you're going to click on the view called System and Service Requests. And at that point, you're going to see a list of all of your environments, and you're going to see them in a table with this header above your table. And you've got a number of buttons here. So you've got an option to view, request system, et cetera, across the right. Depending on which environment you've got selected may determine the buttons that are available to you. And I didn't explain the view button, but the view button is just kind of gives you a pop-up that tells you a little bit more information about that particular environment. The one we're really interested in today is the one on the far right, which is the refresh system, but I will briefly discuss the other one so that you know that functionality is there as well. So starting from left to right, request system, typically used during configuration to order a specific environment, such as an empty environment or a complete copy. But something to be aware of, this is something that's very useful to us when we are configuring your system. And it's not really chances are you would not necessarily have a use for this today. So I can't think of a reason if you're in the live production environment why you may want to use the request system option. If someone else knows of a reason, please let me know. If you have been using this feature for a long time, the refresh system was not available. That button did not exist, and you used to have to do a couple of extra steps. You used to have to terminate your existing test system, and then you would use the request system button in order to build a brand new environment. And that consequently created a new 6-digit URL, which was maybe good and bad. It caused problems with the users because their bookmarks were broken. So that way to create a test environment is not really commonly used now that they have this new feature called the refresh system, which preserves your URL. But that maybe is a reason. So if for some reason you wanted to sort of hide this test environment from your users, you wanted to create it in a discrete way, maybe for some software development or something, you could terminate your test system and request a new one with a new environment. So that is a possibility. So then working over to the center, we've got something called copy solution profile. Once again, this is really commonly used as far as the configuration. What that does is it copies the configuration settings, a certain amount of those settings, over to a new environment, but it does not copy over any of the data. And so this is a very powerful feature that we require when we're configuring your initial system. Then we copy the settings over into your production environment to save a lot of time. Once again, if you are live in a current production environment, I can't really think of a reason why you would use copy solution profile. So you can probably ignore that. You do have the ability to set up multiple test environments. So very likely you have two. If you do want to purchase an additional system, so you want to separate a separate environment out in your little SAP universe, it is possible to do that. You could also talk to our your customer account executive to help you with that as well. Now the restore point, that is something that you could possibly use in a production or test environment. So if you do want to just take a snapshot that is archived on SAP servers, meaning that you don't immediately have access to it, it's just essentially a data extract, once again, of a certain point in time, they will take that backup and they will preserve it for a couple of weeks for you. And then you could, in fact, launch a process inside SAP Support to restore your system to that backup. So this could be useful if you were doing something really significant in your system where you thought there was some sort of a risk and there was a potential that you would need to roll back your entire environment. So hopefully unlikely, but that if that comes up, that might be a useful feature. And then the real reason we're here for this cafe is to talk about your refresh system. So this one is more commonly used. This meets all the needs I previously mentioned. So once you're live, this is the button you will use in order to copy a complete production environment and overwrite and therefore discard your previous test environment. So how exactly does that work? When you click that button, you're going to get a pop-up that looks like this, and it's fairly straightforward. So they give you a little bit of information at the top. They talk to you about the fact that there is a downtime. And your refresh type, you will almost always refresh from a source system. There is an option to refresh from an empty system. Once again, I don't know why you would need that once you're live. So you would simply choose that option, refresh from source system. And then in the source system field, when you invoke that field, it'll tell you a list of your environments, and you're going to choose your production environment as your source system. So that's the one that is going to provide the data in which you want to use in your test system. And then I have blurred that out just for privacy reasons here, but you will see the URL of the test system that's going to be overwritten in that third field. And then on the downtime start, this is where, back to that planning, you're going to want to choose a time when you're going to have low impact to your users. So if there isn't a sense of urgency around this refresh, try and do this at 2 in the morning, something like that, which is the example that I have in here. And your production system will go down. I believe SAP will warn you, and I believe that they will they kind of lean towards the cautious side. So I believe they're going to say that you're potentially down for 2 or 3 hours. I have seen refresh downtimes that have been as short as 30 minutes, but don't count on that. I imagine that depends on how busy their servers are, how busy their call centers are. Copy all attachments and copy change documents. Those are two very rarely used options. There's just not a lot of reasons why you would necessarily need all of the attachments or all of the records of how things have been modified in your system. And what I mean by that is, let's say you go in and you update a vendor to add a new address. The system tracks the old address as well as all the changes, who made that change, the date it happens. So the change document tables inside SAP ByDesign are enormous. They hold a massive amount of data. And then depending on the type of attachments you've loaded, so if you've loaded PDFs and things like that of all of your supplier invoices, drawings and your manufacturing, whatever it is that you're loading as attachments, that also could be a significant amount of data. So choosing to copy those into your test will significantly increase the amount of time it takes to have your test environment stood up. I've never actually run this, so I can't speak to how long. It would obviously depend on the amount of data you have, but keep that in mind. So I can't think of many reasons why you would really need that data in a test environment unless it was maybe for some sort of an audit purpose. Okay, moving on. A couple of other available details. So I'm giving you now the whole screenshot where previously I just showed you the header of that table. So there is a bit of information before you press that refresh system. You can examine in here and you can see that I have highlighted one of my systems. So it's my production environment. I can tell that because of the system type. So that's how you know which is your production system and what is your test system. And there's some interesting information in there. So there's your system URL. So that is a clickable link directly from that screen. If you want to open up one of the other environments that you're not currently logged into, you can do that. I should also mention, you can launch this request from any of your environments inside your SAP ByDesign universe. The Service Control Center looks exactly the same. So you can order that refresh either from your test or from your production environment. It doesn't matter where you do it from. And I will point out at the top, there is some information about the next upgrade. So I mentioned earlier that if you are in an upgrade window, and as luck would have it, we happen to be in one. So between May 7th and May 24th, no new system requests are possible. So because of that, this was a problem for me because, in fact, this particular environment, I was trying to do a refresh on behalf of our users who needed it, and also as an experiment for this Café. So unfortunately, I ran into that issue because I hadn't been checking the calendar ahead of time. So keep that in mind. That's a like 2-week outage, right, that you have to be aware of, and those outages happen every 3 months. And once again, I keep saying the word outage. I should really just say your systems are available. You just can't do these kind of updates. Has a restore point. So that flag on the far right of the table, if you've been asked for a restore point, using the request restore point button, then that will tell you that there is one in place. But after 14 days, that database will get purged from SAP servers and it's no longer available to you. So if you are doing restore points, the SAP assumes they are stale after 14 days. And that probably makes sense. They're probably stale after 1 day if it's your production environment. So keep that in mind if you do want to go in and make restore points more frequently than that. And then whatever environment that you have selected in that table, so in this example, the production environment is the one that's selected, you can see a panel at the bottom of your screen, which just gives you a bit of information about that environment. So some of the same information you're seeing in the table is there, but you could also see how long this database has been running. So how long have you been up and running? And that's useful in the test environment. If you want to be able to see kind of how the last time it was refreshed, all that information could be useful. Sometimes I just go into the test environment and I just go to the journal entry screen and I can see the last journal entry. That's another good way to tell how recent your test environment is. So once you've submitted your request, back to that service control center, there is an option there for service requests. And just as a good habit, as soon as I submit it, I like to go in here and I like to verify the request is sitting in this queue. Unfortunately, because of SAP's upgrade in the period right now, I was not able to book one, so I don't have a request sitting here, so my screen is blank. But if you do successfully submit your request, you will see the nature of that request, when you created, and most importantly, when it's planned for. So you could maybe just double check on that. And if you are sort of staying up late to monitor that it was successful and your environment has been restored as planned, you could come in here and see the status as well. So once that's all done, you have your new environment. I thought I'd just also include a little helpful hint. So your environment is going to be exactly identical to production because it is a copy. So if your previous test system had been specially color coded or labeled to indicate that it was test, you now need to go back into your test environment, your recently refreshed environment, and recolor the background. So if you don't know how that works, you just go into your adaptation mode. You can see that in the top right. And you can do that right from your home My Launch Pad. So the very first screen you land on when you open up SAP. And when you open up the adaptation mode, you're going to see in the right panel the word background design. And you actually have to do something a little unusual here. You have to right click, which is kind of an odd thing to do inside a web browser. But if you do a right click, you're going to see that little option pop up that says change company logo, reset company logo, and then a bunch of characters like RGB115, which is just the color palette code identifier to tell you which color this environment is set to. So at that point, you could click on the change company logo. It'll launch a Windows Explorer, so you could find a new PNG file to put up in the right corner of your screen. So it's not a bad idea to have a logo there that says something like the word test. And then at the same time, click on that little color palette, choose something fun and colorful for your environment that's not too outrageous or offensive for your users. And then maybe just also send out an email or communication that the refresh is done. And it's not a bad idea to have some sort of agreement that production is always blue and test is always green, or whatever you decide for your organization. Be consistent that way. There is really, it's a terrible thing for people to, well, either way, for people to do production work in testing. We have no way to move that open. If they thought they were in production and they were in test, we have no way to transfer those, a day of work, back over to the production environment. It's also a terrible feeling to set up fake data in the production system. So you do want to make sure that people are very abundantly clear on which environment is which. So just a quick recap. And maybe before we do that, let me just pop in. I'm not going to show you that refresh process, but I said a lot there for the logo thing. So I'm just going to show that to you in this environment. So I'm going to go into my key user settings. So I got a weird rendering thing here. Turn on my adaptation mode. And then I'll just show you exactly what I said there. So when I right click, that's when I get this option. So in here, I can pop up my color palette. Ooh, pumpkin. And I can also change my logo. So when I click that, this is where it's going to launch. So I pre-prepared a little logo. I just did that in a little screenshot program. So I put in the word test. And so that just overwrites the default logo, which was either, if you've never put in your own company's logo, it says SAP. Otherwise, it's maybe your own logo. So it's a really good idea to make this really abundantly clear to your users that they're in the test system. So once you've made those changes, you just publish this to all to help you with that. So a good example of why you might want a separate test environment, and where some clients do, is if they have a lot of customizations in their system, which is maybe why you're asking this. So if you have functional testing, meaning your accountants, your manufacturing, people who are just functional users in the system want to test SAP features, and you have developers that are developing new enhancements for your system, a lot of times those two activities are not compatible. Like one group wants a system refresh, the other one absolutely doesn't want it refreshed because they've got code sitting there that they're working on. So that's a very good example of a time when you may want to have a second test tenant in place. So just to recap what we were saying, work with your users to ensure that the refresh won't impact them. That's really important. You could really frustrate somebody if you blow away a bunch of testing scenarios that they're doing. And also keep in mind that production outage. Like I've said it quite a few times, so keep an eye on that calendar. Make sure that you're not trying to do something. You're going to have to plan around SAP's quarterly updates. We have really no control over that. I should mention, if you do have an exclusive, it's called the private tenant, if I'm using the right word. It's like a private tenant edition where you're the only ByDesign customer, you're paying more for that on that particular server. Then you do have some negotiation room with SAP as far as when upgrades would happen. So that's typically for really large clients who want a bit more IT control on that kind of stuff. System refresh creates the identical environment, so keep in mind, do those things to not confuse users. Add dates to the logo, great idea. Access to Service Control Center is really meant for super users or system administrators. So yeah, just a reminder on that, like anybody's welcome to these Q&A cafes. If you're wondering why you don't see that Service Control Center, it may be because it's more of an IT function and those requests go through your IT department. Or maybe you do see it and you're wondering why you do see it. Maybe you should let your admin person know you have access to something you shouldn't, because really you want to make sure people govern themselves accordingly and work as a team and get the whole sort of organization's permission to do this type of an event. And lastly, I'd just say that a test environment is just a great feature. So I think a lot of our clients aren't really aware that they can go in and do this themselves. Sometimes they will open up a ticket with us, which is fine. We're happy to help you with this. But this gives you a little bit more freedom. So I hope some of the people attending this call, if they want to just take on this activity themselves, it's not difficult. You just need to make sure you're doing it right. And it's a really handy asset to keep that test environment current for training and testing on new ideas in the system. With that, I will pass it on back to Catherine, and I just want to thank everybody for their time.